Welcome back, everybody, for another webinar organized by Princeton for everyone worldwide. We're very happy to have Daron Acemoglu with us from MIT. Hi, Daron.
Hi, Markus. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you. Daron will talk about power and progress, and it's based on his new book, which just came out together with Simon Johnson. So we will hear about his book today, and it's, as usual, a big book. He has his third, I think, in this trilogy, and he will talk about power and progress. Let me give you some few opening remarks. I think the main idea is that progress is technological advancement, and the question is, where is the technological advancement coming? And what I will do is I will just look at a simple production function and see, oh, can it be TFP productivity? Can it be labor productivity or some capital productivity? Or it can be the production function, the interaction between the two. And the big question is, for example, if you increase labor productivity, will this be leading to an increase in labor demand, higher wages, and leads to some shared prosperity and helps also, the workers as well, and only the capitalists in a sense. And it depends very much what the elasticity of substitution is between capital and labor. So for example, if the perfect substitutes and labor productivity goes up, workers will benefit a lot. That leads to the shared prosperity. Similarly, if you have Cobb-Douglas, then expenditure shares are constant. So if labor productivity goes up, workers have to work less and get the same income shares, and it's still benefiting them. But if it's a Leontief and you have this complement Leontief structure, then actually you can save on the labor input and have still the same output. So these are the isoquants. And nevertheless, so there will be fewer workers working and the labor share is actually going down. And this way it's a cost cutting. So whether it's a prosperity, shared prosperity, or cost cutting, hurting the workers or benefiting the workers, this productivity increase depends very much on this elasticity of substitution. Of course, if you have TFP growth, that also is beneficial for all of society. In a sense, Marx always thought that, if we have technological progress and capitalism will ruin itself, and it was his error, essentially, that it was also shared the prosperity with the rest of it. Now, what really matters then is actually the production function, the elasticity substitution between the two inputs, but it also the curvature of the production function matters a lot. So I have another little figure to illustrate that. So what you get as a work, you get the marginal productivity of labor. So the F prime with respect to labor, that's the slope of the orange production function here. And if you think what you get from the total output or what the workers are getting is essentially F prime times the labor input. What's F prime is the slope of the tangent line here. And what is F prime times labor? That's essentially the height of this little vertical line here. So because, the tangent is just going down here and a 1. And if you multiply it by capital L, then you get this vertical line. And the rest goes to the investors. Now, let me propose a technological advancement which leads to a much higher productivity function. And this higher productivity function then, leads to increase in marginal productivity of labor as well. And what you can see here, there's an expansion in output, this goes to the workers because now marginal productivity is much higher of labor, but it also meets a decline what the investors get. So in this case, it is the case not only does workers get more, they get more because output is more, but they get also much, much more. And actually the investors get in total, they get actually less. What does this mean? If the investors decide whether to go for these productivity enhancements, they will actually not go for it because they will hate it that the investor share is going down in this case. So in both examples, it is the case that actually, what the productivity increase might not be beneficial for the workers in this example. Now, of course, you can say some productivity enhancements don't show up in wages at all. Because they are part of the household production function. And if I use my iPhone and I use my YouTube, if I have to fix something in my house at home, YouTube is very useful to fix things and look things up. So there might be a better matching of movies and vacation as well, finding something on Airbnb and so forth. And that also increases the household production function. But the big question I think Daron will address is, who has the power to decide which direction the progress goes, and who decides it? So in a sense, who is deciding it? To a large extent, the big basic research is decided by the military arm of the government. So DARPA is deciding. So the jet engine, internet, computer chip, telecom, all of this essentially was initially decided by the military expenditures to enhance military fighting capacity. Or is it Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, Sam Altman, or in the case of vaccines, Ugur Sahin, Özlem Türeci, some immigrants, Turkish immigrants to Germany who developed them and were very critical for the mRNA vaccines? Or is it the capital market? Is it the venture capitalist ecosystems or the large firms? So that's I think Daron will go into that. And of course, often it goes in the wrong direction. If you think about health and drug development, there's of course less resources devoted to develop a new malaria vaccine, more Viagra. And the question is this really more important than the other one? And there's also a question to what extent, there's different stages of innovation. There's the fundamental innovation, and then there's the late implementation. So putting things together like what Apple did on the iPhone is putting everything nicely together might be the final implementation stage, and who is deciding at what stage. So we can also think of different stages where decisions will be made. Finally, this new innovations leads to changes, and what the speed of the change. And this leads me to my favorite topic, resilience, essentially. If you slow down the speed of change, do you have some extra time? Does it give it some time if you have disruptions, you can bounce back more easily? Or does it lead to more adverse feedback loops? Sometimes when you can react, you can trigger some adverse feedback loops. So that's essentially still an open question whether that helps. And does the slowdown really help the good actors or the malicious actors? So that's often the argument. Essentially, if you slow down the AI development now, it just helps the malicious actors to catch up rather than the good ones. So let me conclude with poll questions Daron put forward. And here are the answers. So the first question was, are there strong automatic forces that ensure that most people will ultimately benefit from the technological progress and to expanding productivity and social capabilities? Do you agree with that? It's true, maybe, or false? And most of the audience thought, yeah, it's true, 45%, maybe 34%, and false thought 21%. So most of them thought it's true. Then second question, more generally, or very specific, generative artificial intelligence is going in a direction that will spearhead important advances. Do you think this is really something important? 57% said yes, 40% maybe, and 3% it is not the case. I would say it's definitely the case, but I might be biased. And the third question is, the main problem in the tech industry right now is bad regulation that is slowing down the pace of advancements. Lighter regulation would actually improve things. And only, I think, 13% that that's true. 36% thought maybe, and it's false 51%. People think that's not really, regulators are not really slowing things down. Might be different from continent to continent, as well. But now we here to Daron, who is devoted, I think, 3 decades of his life to these questions, and he has summarized or put everything nicely together in a book, and we are looking forward to his presentation. Thanks again, Daron, for being with us, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Markus. It's a pleasure and an honor to be on the Markus Academy to talk about these issues in general, and also about the book that I co-wrote with Simon Johnson. So thanks for giving us the opportunity. And this was, as usual, this is my second Markus Academy. I was very impressed by Markus's excellent introduction the first time. So this time I'm less impressed because I was expecting it, but it's an excellent introduction still.
Thank you.
And then your answers to the questions really frame the issues. In fact, what I'm going to try to do is to swim against the current and try to argue that the answer to the first question should not have been true. Probably false would have been my choice. And that is an important part of the conceptual framework and reading of history in the book that I'm going to try to share. And then the answer to the second question should have been more maybe, rather than definitely true that generative AI is taking us in towards a broadly beneficial direction. So, but in the process of doing that, it will also be my pleasure to share some more of the arguments of the book. So I hope you can see this. Yes. So this is Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. And as the title suggests, we're trying to think about issues of technology and progress, but also at the same time, put this in a historical perspective. And I'll try to argue why this historical perspective is important. And the context, of course, as Markus explained, and the beginning questions were also framing, is in AI. The advances that we're seeing right now are truly impressive. But in the midst of some of the concerns and much of the excitement, I think the questions that are insufficiently asked are: who controls the future? Who's really setting the agenda? Because there isn't a preordained path of AI or any other technology. So there are decisions that people make, entrepreneurs, government leaders, people in society in general, about where technology will go and who will benefit from them, who will control machine intelligence, and what is it that we want from machine intelligence. And these are, of course, foundational if we want to view the shared prosperity question in a broader light. Will generative AI serve only a technological elite or underpin broad prosperity? As in every technological transition, there are many choices here. And that's one of the first points that Simon and I try to emphasize. And when there are choices, there are visions. Whose ideas, whose visions, whose ideology is going to be crucial, because that's distinct but very closely related to the question of who's going to gain. So if you look at previous periods, you'll see a lot of the inspiring leaders who are shaping the path of technology. We could have picked many examples, but few of them are as colorful as this gentleman, Ferdinand de Lesseps, who played a major role in some of the most important technological developments of the second half of the 19th century. He was a techno-optimist of his age, and he was also an optimist about how technology, commerce, and broader progress were intimately linked. And that optimism and his great skills and leadership and vision were crucial for his almost single-handed campaign to have the Suez Canal built, which was very successful. Few other people could have managed to bring thousands of investors around Europe financing it, convince the French and Egyptian authorities, have a particular vision that how people would make money from this and how this was linked to interoceanic shipments. And in many of these things, he became completely successful in terms of actually spearheading others to do the technological work that was necessary for his canal digging. And at the end of the Suez Canal, he emerged as, perhaps, if lack of a better term, the Elon Musk of his age, where everybody saw him as the visionary with a strong interest in spearheading the next level of advances. But it also made him more hubristic than he already was. And he brought the same optimism to the building of the Panama Canal, which turned out to be a complete failure, both because he did not completely understand the conditions that he was facing on the ground, and also because the technological vision that he had for the Panama Canal just didn't seem to work. In particular, he was so keen on building canals without locks because locks would slow down traffic, and slowing down traffic was unacceptable to him. But it turned out that wasn't feasible in Panama. And the outcome of this was financial ruin to thousands of people, but even worse, 22,000 people died trying to build the canal. So the question
Daron, can I ask you?
of course,
sorry.
Markus, yeah, go ahead.
Is it always an individual? Because you emphasize the role of the vision, and vision is typically comes from individuals, or is it more like the vision comes from interaction of many peoples together?
It does come from the interaction of many people. So that's why Ferdinand de Lesseps is very interesting, because it's actually more individual than in many other instances. So you can tell the story of hubris, but it's general. It's actually a collection of people. So in today's world, and I'll come back to that, it's not just one person, but there is a general culture of Silicon Valley that views progress in a particular light, machine intelligence in a particular light, digital technologies in a particular light, and economic growth in a particular light. So there is some confluence there, and we'll come back to that, but that's a very important point. Thanks for sort of bringing that up. So the question here is, this vision issue is so important precisely because Simon and I argue that the answer to the first question that was in your poll is more complex than just it's being true. That there isn't a guarantee that advances that increase output and our capabilities are automatically going to translate into shared prosperity. But in economics, in fact, as Markus explained, there are strong reasons for thinking it may do so. And in fact, if it's going to lead to shared prosperity, of course, we know, as Markus also emphasized, it has to work through the labor market. Most of us earn our living in the labor market. So if it doesn't really increase wages or improve conditions in the labor market, it's much harder for a technological advance to lead to shared prosperity. So why do many economists, and here, I would also refer to my own book on economic growth I wrote in 2007, which has this pretty widely communicated throughout its pages. Why do economists think that there is a fairly strong reason for this type of shared prosperity from technological advances? And Simon and I call that the productivity bandwagon. Productivity, just like a powerful engine, is going to pull people together with it. And the mechanism is easy. First, technology improves. That raises productivity. And as productivity increases, firms rush out to hire more employees, and that pushes up wages, and workers also benefit. Now, I'm going to try to argue why the productivity bandwagon is not as secure, and that's the reason why I don't think we should say automatically technological advances will lead to these type of benefits. But before doing that, let me just give you two examples of revolutionary technologies for their age that don't seem to have generated this type of productivity bandwagon. So the medieval period, sometimes called the Dark Ages, was far from dark. It was full of technological advances that really transformed both agriculture and other sectors of the economy. And one of the iconic ones are the windmills that improved productivity quite significantly in many activities. So you might expect from the productivity bandwagon that these mills would also improve the conditions of the peasants. But in fact, there is no evidence that peasants did any better out of this or many other innovations of the era. And most of the additional output, agricultural output, that was generated by windmills and things like horseshoes and better crop rotation was captured by a narrow elite, the clergy and the nobility, with very little change in the living conditions and wages of peasants. Even more stark is this machine here, the cotton gin, which was revolutionary for the United States. The US South had a variety of cotton that couldn't be cleaned with existing gins. And so cotton production was essentially minimal in the United States. And with Eli Whitney's cotton gin and some related cotton gins, at the end of the 18th century, the Southern economy was completely revolutionized, and the United States in a few years became the largest exporter and producer of cotton in the world. But the workers who did that cotton production, the enslaved people of the United States, did not have any benefits. In fact, their conditions worsened because they moved into cotton plantations where work was much harder, and they moved to the deeper South where the general repression was more intense. The reason why, go ahead, Markus.
So these are two examples where it's actually probably the technology. So there are two reasons for that. One is this technology, the elasticity of substitution in a sense, or it could be the political power, that the bargaining power is shifting. Would you argue in this case it was more the technology aspects, or it was more the bargaining power between, say, the capitalist and the workers?
Excellent. So you pointed out the two pillars that I was going to be a little bit more explicit on in a second, but it's good for you to ask it at this point. So you really need two aspects for shared prosperity. One is that technology changes in a direction, as you also explicated, that increases worker marginal productivity. And second, that workers have a chance of benefiting from that higher marginal productivity. So in these two examples, it's the coercive structure of the economy that made sure that, in fact, employers would get most of the benefits, and it could change the structure of production as they did in the US South, even to the detriment of the workers who were becoming more productive. And now I'm coming to the other aspect of it, which is the nature of technology, and then I'm going to pull the two together. And the same sort of institutional issues, whether workers benefit from increases in productivity because of bargaining, because of coercion, or other issues, is relevant in the Industrial Revolution as well. But another aspect is very visible in the Industrial Revolution, that the nature of the technological changes were very anti-labor. And in particular, the early stages of the Industrial Revolution are characterized by the factory system and textile machinery that automated work, mechanized work that skilled artisans used to perform. What that resulted in is that there was a lot of automation of human work, and workers then were also put in factories where there was much closer, tighter monitoring of what they were doing. So the combination of these two things was that actually the marginal productivity of workers did not increase, despite the fact that new technological advances were being made. And this was a very important part of the reason why for the first about 100 years of the Industrial Revolution, you don't see much increases in wages. And at the same time, working conditions are worsening for workers. By the way, that wasn't all that was going on in the Industrial Revolution. The factory system also was a revolution in how discipline was imposed. The spirit of that is actually captured by this contraption here, which is famous from Michel Foucault's philosophy and the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, the panopticon of Jeremy Bentham. This was never actually implemented, even though Bentham thought that it was very easy to put to practice in hospitals, schools, prisons, and factories. But no matter, many employers organized production in factory systems that intensified monitoring and reduced autonomy and lengthened working hours, which was another important part of the reason why you cannot talk of shared prosperity in the first half of the 20th century. And the other was the way in which the public infrastructure was completely unready for the very large number of people who were packed into cities. Pollution and infectious diseases became rampant. Life expectancy may have declined to as little as 30 years at birth in the British cities at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So all of these may appear like history, and we should learn from history, but also have a healthy distance from it, meaning that, we are fortunate to live in a post-industrial world in which things are much better, leaders are much more enlightened, science plays much of a role. Yes, all of those are true, and indeed modern times are different, and we see some of that difference very visibly if we look at the recent past, but there are also some strange parallels. And one way of seeing that—
Daron, can I ask another quick question? Would you in the 19th century would have said we should actually prevent these innovations?
Aha. Great question.
Or would you say we have to go through this valley in order, because if you look back—
No, I'm going to come to that. You're several steps ahead of me, Markus, but since you raised it now, let me answer it, because that's a very, very important problem. Very, very important question. And I think part of the reason, and perhaps this should be even clearer in the book, but part of the reason we wrote the book is because that is the wrong question. So that is the wrong question. And unfortunately, that's the way that many economists frame the question. You're either for or against technology. So think of technology as a river. So the question is, are you going to let the river flow, or are you going to put a dam and block it completely? And if it comes to that, you might say, well, look, we've created a lot of casualties along the way, but blocking it would have been even worse. And if you wanted to block it, you would be a Luddite, and that's the worst thing. No, we think that's the wrong choice. There are ways of redirecting the river. And if you redirect it, you may have many or most of the benefits, or sometimes even more of the benefits without some of the costs. So in other words, we do not have to go through the savages of the early industrial revolution. We don't have to send children as young as 5 and 6 to coal miles to work 18 hours a day and push carts with their heads until they have brain damage in order to benefit from industrial technology, nor do we need to just singularly follow an agenda of automate everything and sideline humans to get the benefits. And that's, I think, the most important message that we want to convey. And that's the sense in which progress is not automatic. You can create damage. That damage can be very long lasting, or you can try to reshape the path of technology to some extent, as well as institutions, in order to get the better out of it. And I'm going to try to articulate why that's actually particularly relevant for today in the age of AI, but also very relevant for post-war growth. And that's what this picture was sort of meant to start the conversation about post-war growth. And what it depicts are the evolution of real wages of 10 demographic groups distinguished by gender and education, all the way from workers with less than high school in orange to workers with with a postgraduate degree in dark blue. Everything normalized to 0 so that you can trace the evolution of real wages or the growth of real wages. And what you see here are the two faces of the coin of the post-war industrialized nation growth. First, you have this phase of very shared prosperity. Here, I'm showing it from 1963 onwards. You can see all of these 10 curves are essentially on top of each other, indicating that they're all growing more or less at the same rate. That is an impressive rate of about 2.5% growth in real terms per year. And if I extended this picture to the 1950s and to all the way to 1949, using different data sources and somewhat different educational categories, you would see, in fact, overall, low education workers are experiencing faster growth in their real wages than some of the high education groups. So that's the shared prosperity. But then from 1980, you see something, quite different, a sea change relative to what was going on in the 3 decades following World War II, and a little bit more reminiscent to the non-shared prosperity of the early industrial revolution. You see the gap between these curves opening up, but even more strikingly, and very unusually for modern industrialized growth, the real wages of low education groups are actually declining. Look at what's going on to high school dropout men or high school graduate men in green and high school dropout men in orange. So this is a very extreme form of non-shared prosperity.
So can I just
of course,
put a little bit of sand in it? In a sense, it doesn't need to be due to technology. We also included hundreds of millions of Chinese in the labor force. So there's a lot of globalization effects as well, leading to a similar force here. So
absolutely,
one has to disentangle, I guess, these different forces.
Absolutely, and globalization in general is very important. If we go a little more technical, you also want to distinguish offshoring aspect of globalization from the goods trade, final goods trade. Both of them have mattered as well as technology. And in some of my work with Pasquale Restrepo, we try to unpack those. Now, again, going a little bit more technical. So the forces that I'm going to argue in a second more explicitly, that is very much related to this is automation. And automation and offshoring act in tandem. Globalization also creates tensions, but it doesn't create the same degree of distributional effects. On employment, it has had very large impacts in the United States, as documented by the seminal work by Outer, Daron, and Hansen, for example, as well as some of the work that I've done. But I'll show you in a second, the role of offshoring and automation has been much larger. And that's because of the bias that things that eliminate labor from the production process play.
Second question I have is that here you see that actually the less educated people, suffered more than the well-educated. Would you expect with AI to reverse this? Because, it fits much more, well-educated people than factory workers.
On that question, I'm going to hold off.
Okay.
I'm going to come to that. That's another excellent question. But for that one, I really want to hold off. Okay. Definitely, it's a first order question, but I have 3 slides on that, so I'll come to that in a second. No, it's good. It's good. You're asking these excellent questions. Let me just also point out that this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. The specific way in which this has happened, the way that globalization impacted, and the way that this was against the background of low institutional constraints on wages via unions, institutions, and social norms was unique to the United States. But the increase in inequality and the stagnation of the real earnings of low education workers is very common across the industrialized world. So, for example, the omnibus measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient, increases pretty much everywhere in the OECD, even though US was already ahead in terms of inequality and has had one of the largest increases.
That's wage inequality, or what type of?
This is income inequality.
This
is income inequality. So, so I think we need to have a holistic interpretation of how growth was shared in the decades that I showed you the data for. In fact, starting from early on in the 20th century, and why that shared prosperity model broke down. And that's where exactly the point that Markus already anticipated is we really need to understand what are the pillars that support productivity bandwagon. And I think you can see them in the auto industry in the very early decades of the 19th century. And I would say the keys are new tasks and worker power. So this is a picture from the Rouge plant of Ford Motor Company, which was a pioneer in introducing new machinery, the assembly line system, decentralized electricity, and much better organization of the factory. So these may sound somewhat related to automation, and they are, but that wasn't the only thing that Ford did. While at the same time he was reorganizing the factory, he also introduced a whole lot of new worker tasks. So as electricity was introduced, then you also had better machinists, more technical tasks, more design, more repair, better use of human workers in the process, as well as a whole slew of back office, white collar tasks that became very widespread in the car industry and in other industries. As a result of this, from 10,000, 20,000 cars at the beginning of the century, the United States was producing millions of cars in the 1930s and 40s, and the number of employees in the car industry increased to over 400,000. So this was the key that you see, that as productivity is increasing, also labor demand is rising because of the new tasks that the production process now entails. But secondly, also, the car industry was at the heart of worker organization. Workers required better treatment from the employers via their organization. They also bargained for higher wages, obviously, better working conditions, but also for more new tasks and training to go with it. So this was, for example, one of the iconic strikes of the period, the sit-down strike of 1937 against GM, that is emblematic of workers becoming more organized and wanting to share in the benefits that the new technologies and new organizations were bringing to the industry. So why did this model break down in the post-1980 United States, for example? Well, it broke down because both of its pillars got emancipated. So you see now the car assembly lines of today, industrial robots have increased productivity massively. And I'll emphasize this again. Simon and I are not against automation. We think automation is fantastic, is great, and has to be part of the future. But the problem is that when you contrast it with the Ford Motor Factory, here you see only automation. You don't see the workers here. In the Ford Motor Factory, you had all of these workers centrally involved in the production process. So here you have the automation, but none of the new tasks going with it. And that was too much focus on automation. So now coming back to Markus's question.
But then, sorry, but the workers might just go into other jobs which are more creative and
that's
less
right. They
better
may.
than being on an assembly line.
Absolutely. And that's, I can't give you that. I can't communicate that via a figure, but we argue there wasn't enough of those other tasks in other industries as well.
Okay. But do you think it's more, again, coming back a technology thing, or it's more a worker power having influence on the production process?
I think both. I think both. But here is one picture that tries to summarize my work with Pasquale Restrepo that emphasizes the importance of technology. So here is the same period that we are looking at. Now, each dot represents not the 10 demographic groups that I showed you, but more detailed demographic groups distinguished by age, education, ethnicity, and gender. The size of the dot is how large that demographic group is. The color coding again shows you the education, so you can see the educations. On the vertical axis, I have the 1980 to 2016 wage change. So from the beginning of the inequality period to the end, the more recent period. And the most interesting part here is you can see that many of these demographic groups are again below the zero line. So they're actually experiencing real wage declines. And the key right-hand side variable I want to emphasize is automation. So on the horizontal axis, I'm showing you Pasquale and my estimate of what is the share of tasks that these demographic groups used to perform in 1980 that have since been automated. And you see a really strong relationship here. This variable by itself explains somewhere between 50 to 70% of the between group inequality in the United States. And equally important, you see that all of these groups that are experiencing significant real wage declines post-1980 are those that have experienced a lot of automation. But it's not just technology, exactly like Markus emphasized. Also, how we share the gains change, and that changed because of institutions and because of visions. The visions, there are many fathers, but let's single out one of our own, Milton Friedman, who articulated the idea that corporations should just look after their shareholder. The social responsibility of business is to increase its profits, he prophesied. And that was an articulation, a justification, hence a powerful vision for companies often squeezing workers harder in order to transfer more value to their shareholders. And the main organization that could have stood against it, the labor movement, got much weaker during that period, both because blue-collar workers became less important, but also because of institutional changes. For example, Reagan's very famous firing of professional air traffic controllers in the strike of 1981. So both pillars of shared prosperity got much weaker in the post-1980 era.
I mean, the different reading of Milton Friedman is also that if you don't have this focus, the CEOs or the important employees in a firm just go for their pet projects. And that's why you need that.
Yes, would be alternative reading, and I'm sure both of them are taking place, especially we call this the Friedman Doctrine with the Jensen Amendment. So Michael Jensen's ideas of take the free cash flow out, etc., were important, but we also argue and provide evidence, and I provide evidence in some of my other work, but let me not get into that, that the idea of taking from workers, giving it to shareholders via automation and via not giving generous wage raises was an important part of what was going on as well. So now we come to your question, Markus, and that's central. Can the age of AI be different? And my answer, Simon, and my answer is yes. AI has an unparalleled capability to complement knowledge work that could increase worker tasks, increase worker productivity, and directly or indirectly help a variety of different skills. But just like whether the gains from corporations benefit shareholders or workers, just like what you want from canals, just like what you want from industrial revolution, visions are going to matter. And ever since the beginning of AI, two very different visions have been pulling it in different directions. And I think this is really central to recognize. And it is particularly central to recognize because one of these visions, I think, is much more likely to lead us to a ruinous path, and it is very dominant today. That first vision is what, for lack of a better term, call it the Turing vision, which is that of autonomous machine intelligence, which can do and should do things better than humans. If you have that vision, it is natural that you go for automation, because the measure of your success in machines is how well they do like humans, and hence replace humans. Even the word machine intelligence, I think, pushes us in that direction. Why should we want machine intelligence? But the second vision, which we call machine usefulness, is a very different one, where AI, just like other things, should be tools for humans. And this was actually very successfully implemented for quite a while. Many of the things that we depend on today, like the mouse or hypertext and whole hyperlinks, even the internet came out of this vision. For example, Douglas Engelbart's big demo, mother of all demos, in which he showed both the mouse, here is the first version of the mouse, and the hypertext, was very much an outcome of this vision of using machines to make humans more productive and make computers easier to use for humans. The problem is not just one of inequality. Go for it, yes.
I just want to understand the way, early innovation was mostly replacing muscles, and now it's about brain.
Yes.
And one could argue that, people, the workers, they have less political power than, well-educated people. And that's why we might go for a different outcome now, but it's probably also unfair that the workers, we replaced and pushed their wages down, while the well-educated class, we go for a different strategy because they're better politically connected.
Well, I would say that would be great if we somehow, as knowledge workers, which, if it's conceived broadly to include not just people like us and journalists, but also include all sorts of back office work, simple routine office work, we became more powerful and we reshaped the path of AI more towards machine usefulness. But going against that, I think the Turing vision and the power of Silicon Valley is powerful enough that I wouldn't bet on it. And that's why I think, again, progress is not automatic.
Can you push it down on a particular example? So ChatGPT, is it a usefulness or replacement?
Neither. It could be either. It could be usefulness if we use ChatGPT as a system for information retrieval, curation, and provision for better human decision-making or complement to human creative work. But it would be a replacement if we use it for simple writing tasks or other things, or some other negative things if we use it for creating more misinformation and more room for digital ads. And I think the path of ChatGPT, as malleable as other technologies, broad general purpose technologies that as I emphasize. So that's why this is a period of important choice. It's a critical period because we have these choices with very different implications. And I think
but
we
it
have
seems like,
emphasized.
so it could be like, let me put it this way, for you, ChatGPT might be very much a machine usable, enhancing your abilities, but for your research assistant, it might replace him. So it's really going for different people differently. No, it's very hard to classify.
Complications that, it could be useful to some skills and replacing other skills. And again, some of that is inevitable. But first of all, when I say it could be more in the human complementary direction, I would say that's for generative AI in general rather than ChatGPT. Now, that's more in the weeds, and perhaps this will come up in the Q&A session. But I think the architecture of ChatGPT is already misaligned with more human complementary tasks. So already more automation and other sort of things that sideline humans is built into the cake of ChatGPT, the way that it has developed and the way that it's been trained. But let's leave that to Q&A if you want. But the other thing I want to point out is that, if you fixate on machine intelligence too much, the main problem or the only problem isn't just inequality. You also don't get the productivity benefits that you were hoping for. And the reason for that is what Pasquale Restrepo and I called socio-automation. So if you use a lot of these machines for automation, but they're not actually that good at what they do, or the humans that they replace were not that bad, you're not going to get big productivity gains, but you may be leaving aside lots of low-hanging fruit where if you could use them for complementary purposes, because then you could have made the humans more productive. So the idea that, if you're sort of questioning automation, you're against progress, that's completely wrong, because as well as automation, if we do the new tasks, we actually elevate the productivity of workers. And that could have a lot of benefits for our macroeconomic performance. Now, of course, if you don't believe me, ask ChatGPT. So we asked ChatGPT, will generative AI reverse these long-term inequality trends of a widening inequality, weaker worker power? And ChatGPT said, perhaps, but probably not. It's not a magic solution. If generative AI is used for replace workers instead of support them, it could have negative consequences. Now, we don't know whether ChatGPT read some of our papers, and that's why it gave this answer. But on this one, we agree with ChatGPT. Now, the other part of the Industrial Revolution that was problematic was the use of new organizations and new technologies for surveillance. And we're redoing that again. We're seeing that both in authoritarian and democratic countries, and in particular, in a worrying way, it is accompanied with centralized control of data. So people draw a big distinction. In the US, the government is not controlling your data all that much, but perhaps it's not much better when Facebook and Google centralize the control of data and information versus the Chinese Communist Party through its social credit system. So I think in both cases, it really creates an environment in which worker productivity and worker autonomy are damaged, and it could also have negative consequences for democracy. Now, all of this may sound like it's just for the developed world, but it has implications for the developing world, because AI, when adopted in the industrialized world, is going to remake the international division of labor. And we see that already from the previous round of blue-collar work, where as robots and other advanced equipment were adopted in the West, we see that routine work declined not just in the West, but also in the developing world as well, and both in manufacturing and services. So if AI goes in a direction that's human replacing, that could actually have massive distributional effects around the world, not just in the industrialized countries. So
can you come back to the figure? I didn't fully understand.
This is showing the change in routine versus non-routine work in manufacturing and services across these countries. And you see that in the emerging world, you're also having a decline in routine work at the same time as you're having decline in routine work in the United States and other industrialized nations.
I see. Wow.
So let me conclude by arguing that this path, which I said is not inevitable, and the element of choice is so important, let me sort of provide Simon and my perspective of what we need to do if we want to reshape technology in a way that we think is socially more beneficial. And we think that it has to start with the right aspirations and the right change in narrative. In terms of aspirations, I think if we agree on the goal, which is making technology more pro-human, I think that will be a big advance. And that will have to be accompanied by a change in narrative where the path of technology is neither preordained nor in the hands of, just very talented entrepreneurs such as Sam Altman and Elon Musk, but it's something that society at large has to decide. And the further we are from like blind techno-optimism, I think the more constructive that debate can be. But just like in the Industrial Revolution, where in the second phase things started going better because of institutional changes, we also need to create countervailing powers. This has to be at the civil society level. Ralph Nader was one of the sort of symbols of that. Many of the consumer protection legislation would not have been feasible without the movement that Ralph Nader epitomizes. And we have to come up with new ways of creating worker voice. It's not just the optics, it's the essence that really is bad when the future of AI is discussed between senators and the CEOs of the major tech companies. No civil society organization, no worker voice is represented in that debate. I think that is a summary of what's wrong with the future of AI at the moment. So, and what we can do is actually very much in line with that machine usefulness vision, or the vision of hackers and computer innovators of the 1960s and 70s, redirect technological change towards new tasks for greater worker productivity, better information for workers and human decision workers, greater human and worker autonomy, empowering workers and citizens. And this is, in fact, people like Ted Nelson and many others like him thought that computers were originally going to do. So he had a vision where computer power would go to the people away from large corporations. And this wasn't completely misguided, because there was that potential. We just didn't use that potential in the same way that social media could have truly democratized information. Again, we did not use that path. We used the path of centralized control that was then monetized through negative externality activities. And just to show you that this is not just a pipe dream, we can actually redirect technological change, and there's no more current example that illustrates that very clearly than energy, where even a small amount of government policy and civil society engagement completely changed the face of technology. In 2000s, even though the climate change challenge was as clear as it is today, there was no way of transitioning to renewable energy because solar, wind, and other forms of renewables were an order of magnitude more expensive than fossil fuel. Today, they are cost competitive with fossil fuels. With a small amount of support, there was a complete redirection of technological change. And what Simon and I argue is that we can and probably should do the same for production technologies, and especially AI today.
Our question, that's a small, because Germany was really pushing the mid-2000s a lot. They put billions behind that to get the scale of the solar energy up.
Yes. And that's where you see the results of that starting around 2010. It took a really long while, especially the German demand was very important for the Chinese solar producers, which started exporting them. At first, they weren't very efficient. And then it really, you had both some important innovation breakthroughs and economies of scale kicking in sometime around 2010.
Can I ask you, so the big question is, who is deciding which direction we are going? So you mentioned Ralph Nader and others, but what's the political process you envision here? Who is making the decisions at the end of the day?
Well,
you don't want to have it in the hands of Silicon
Who's making
Valley.
the decisions about whether we are a democracy or not?
We had a constitution at some point. The people decided.
Right, but take a country that is not democratic. Who decides whether we become democratic? Well, at the end of the day, it's society itself. But sometimes those decisions are delegated, correctly or incorrectly, to some leaders. And that delegation may be part of the problem. So right now, the future of AI is decided in a few boardrooms and in a few offices in Silicon Valley. But that's because we've delegated that power to them unwittingly. We've asked generally governments to regulate lots of things, and we've asked the media to oversee what's going on in powerful organizations. We've asked academia to shed light on these things. And I think we have all sort of given up our responsibilities, and we've become mesmerized by the tech industry, and we've let them play the lead role with very little regulation and oversight. You know, the media that's supposed to cover the tech industry, rather than shed light on it for much of the last 30 years, has been completely mesmerized by it. So as a result, the tech industry has gained a oversized power about the future of technology, even though that choice has fundamental consequences for people around the world.
Yeah, overall, I think the tech, if you just look at the pandemic, you know, the tech advancements really helped us to overcome the pandemic, be it on the technical side, using Zoom and so forth, and also on the healthcare side.
Absolutely.
But let me just push you, the different continents going for different directions in a sense. So you mentioned the Chinese going for surveillance with artificial intelligence. Europe is regulating a lot before even things are developing, and the US is not doing so much. So which camp are you in? Are you more in the European camp, or out of the three, if I characterize it in these three different ways of going about this issue?
Yeah, I would say Europe has the right idea and the bad implementation. Now, of course, you can be cynical and say, and you'll probably be right, that Europe has the right idea because it doesn't have its own tech sector. So it doesn't suffer the consequences of the tech sector losing profits. But I think Europe has the right idea. Look at the GDPR, for example. I think it came at the right time or too late, but it had exactly the right values. It was going after exactly the right metrics, but it hasn't been super successful. Why is that? Is that because regulation is bound to fail, or you cannot regulate AI? No, not at all. This is a very difficult problem. So you have to experiment with different things. And then when you see that something doesn't work because it creates, you know, reactions that enable companies to go around it, then you have to change the regulations. And I think that's where we're failing, because we have lost the regulatory muscle.
But what you see in Europe, as you said, there's no tech sector. That's a reason for that. You don't have any advancements in Europe, or much less of an advancement. And that holds Europe back in the long run. So there's some cost associated, not just redirecting your river, it's also holding up the river to a large extent.
And you know, no tech sector is a bit of an exaggeration. The most advanced chips are made in the Netherlands, for example, and that I would say is much more important than, you know, writing a few more game softwares. You know, so it's not that like, you know, Europe is a complete backwater, but you're right. So the way I would put it is, Markus, is Silicon Valley is an amazing environment. We should be completely grateful for the risk-taking, the energy, the creativity that Silicon Valley has brought over the last several decades. And the United States has benefited from that. But to presume that Silicon Valley has everything right and it should be completely unregulated does not follow from that. We want to use that energy, that risk-taking, but in a set of directions that are more in line with society's priorities. So that's exactly the redirecting the river, not blocking it.
So let me put it a different aspect. I would like to raise a different aspect. So one philosophy is that, you know, if you don't have enough disruptions going on, society has a tendency not to go for changes, and then there will be entrenchments. So the certain powers which are in power, they will not be disrupted. And hence you need occasionally changes and disruptions in order to get rid of these past entrenchments. You're not arguing against that. You just want to redirect the new changes in a particular.
Well, first of all, I think that perspective that you have articulated, I can have a weak version or a strong version. The weak version is that we need some amount of creative destruction. I completely agree with that. But a strong version that we should sort of celebrate disruption, or that today what we are seeing is that sort of disruptive change inevitable. I won't agree with those. First of all, look, under the name of disruptive change, we have empowered the largest and most powerful corporations humanity has ever seen. Silicon Valley says they are celebrating disruption, and at the same time, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon acquire countless companies that could be competitors to them, and many of them, they actually sideline their technologies completely. So what kind of disruption is that? And moreover, disruption, what type of disruption? When the disruption is, there's a monopoly and I replaced it, that's great. When the disruption is thousands of workers are thrown out of their jobs and you create a lot of poverty, that's a different type of disruption. And I think we should use different bars for when that sort of disruption is acceptable versus not acceptable. Definitely, we should not oppose all creative destruction as part of the market economy. But, getting into a mindset where disruption is actually a good, I don't think that's warranted.
So the way I understand you want to go a multifaceted approach, but let me just point you to where you put the emphasis. So one thing you could say, just following what you said, it's antitrust. We have to do a lot in antitrust regulation. Another one is more on labor market regulation, have some worker councils in companies and so forth. There might be different aspects how you can achieve that. Is there one particular one would say this is the most important one, or would say let's just do everything?
100%. You need it's a complex problem. You need a multifaceted approach. So certainly, if the direction of technology is distorted, which we argue it is, then you need market incentives and social incentives to redirect it. One aspect, for example, that I didn't get that much into, but why is it so bad that so much information is centralized in the hands of Facebook, Google, and a few other companies? Well, it's related to how they're monetizing it. So if they're monetizing it in a way that's misleading, or it creates lots of negative social effects, for example, when it comes to political participation, people's control of their own data and so on, that has negative effects. And one of the policies that we argue, in addition to the ones that you've mentioned, are digital ad taxes. The current model where everything is scale, and then you monetize it by making people more and more engaged so that you can send them more ads, that really reduces the room for new business models to emerge. And so digital ad taxes are very valuable, I think, in an environment like that, so that you first of all discourage the worst users of data, and second, you create room for other business models. Same thing, antitrust, I think, would be for the same reason. You're trying to encourage other business models. But also, you may want to create direct incentives for competitions, prizes, X prizes, government prizes for finding more human complementary ways of using AI. We go through several examples in the book where I think there's a lot of potential, like nurses. You can have much better services, diagnosis, cure, prescription by nurses, just like some of that is being done by licensed practitioner nurses today in the United States. If you use AI technologies and better training of nurses, same thing for teachers and much more individualized education programs, for creative artists, for even blue-collar workers. So again, I think we have to encourage that, but I think an important part of this process is worker voice as well. So I think work councils, as in Germany, as long as they can be designed in a way that's not too conflictual, workers working for reshaping work in a more human direction rather than like some ideal of communist revolution, I think that would be much more conducive to the side of a better future for technology. But that requires the right sort of institutional embedding in which you have worker power and worker voice, but not like a mortal combat between management and the labor movement. So I think it's multifaceted.
Two more questions, if I may. So,
of course.
One is, if we look at the large language models in particular, the actual parameter estimations and all that is all secret. We don't know the actual source of OpenAI's ChatGPT. How much would you make this transparent in order to have more entry, essentially, in this market? Or would you say if you make it too transparent, then people can abuse it, and hence there's a need to keep it intransparent, and because otherwise there will be abuse of these technologies? So how do you deal with the transparency issue in this dimension, which is a big issue in my view?
Well, I think the way that I think about this is that transparency would be great, but I think it's not going to be possible. The way that the architecture of generative AI is going, full transparency is not going to be feasible. But I think there are important things that we can do, and that relates to the throwaway comment I made earlier on, that the current architecture of GPT-4 or ChatGPT is not conducive to real human complementary work. I think what you really need to do is to create what you might call greater legibility, greater understanding of humans. So why a particular recommendation is being made, how they can use this program. And that is different than transparency, but very, very related. So for instance, if you have a program that makes a recommendation to me, go left, and it has no explanation, there are only two things I could do. Either I could ignore it or I could follow it. But neither way, my cognition is not improved. And if really what you want is to augment my skill, my expertise, to make me a better worker, a better decision maker, neither of these two paths is yet that useful. So you really need to explain to me, go left because of this. So where does that information come from? Is it reliable? How much should I trust it? How much my priors should I override because of your recommendation? So that requires, A, for me to be able to interrogate the system. B, it requires reliability scores, some measure of uncertainty. C, it requires much more high quality data that goes into these programs. So right now, I think one aspect of that transparency that's problematic is how much of that ChatGPT is coming from Reddit and how much of it is coming from Wikipedia. Wikipedia, I respect more than Reddit. Now, is it that suddenly some of the things that Reddit biases, racism, extremism, crazy conspiracy theories in Reddit are seeping into it? I don't know that. So how do I decide? So all of those things, I think we need to more human usable AI.
So I agree with you. I mean, this European initiative has, of course, this explainability, but if you interpret it too strict, then, any large language model, people themselves don't know it. OpenAI themselves. So essentially exclude, like in Italy, you outlaw ChatGPT.
Yeah. No. I mean, I'm not encouraging outlawing. On the other hand, I would say that the fact that without any guardrails, ChatGPT was made available to people was also not, the peak of responsibility. I mean, what will ChatGPT do to the education system? We have no idea. What will it do to disinformation and misinformation? We have no idea. So going back to what you said at the beginning, I think we have to think in general. We have to try
it out. We have to be thrown.
Well, we have to try it out perhaps on a smaller scale. What's the rush? So for these complex technologies with many, many, many unforeseen consequences, I think you have to experiment. I mean, no large-scale organization would overnight change all of their technologies at once, would they? So why would we are actually imposing that on society at large? So I think experimentation, well, let's try ChatGPT in a few schools. Let's see what it does. Let's try GPT-4 or whatever your favorite large language model is on a few tasks and see what it does, how it's misused. But, that's not the business model, because hype is so important. Market incentives are, we're replacing Google. We're going to incorporate GPT-4 into into Bing and take over the search market. Is that the right future we want? I think those are the questions that we should be asking. I'm not pretending that I know the answers, but the fact that we're not actually asking these questions is worrisome.
Let me throw one more question at you. So it seems like for all future technologies, there's a huge amount of investment, upfront investment needed. if you look at, for example, large language models or also other examples. Is it then justified that we have this concentration of wealth in certain companies? Because these are the only ones which can actually, foot the initial investment.
Well, again, that's a great question, Markus. Thank you. And I'm not sure that we need them. That's, again, the way that the market has gone. So we said, oh, we're going to build these huge foundation models, and we're going to train them with, hundreds of billions of parameters on the entire internet. But an alternative is, no, actually, we have smaller scale models that are more domain specific. If we had done that, that would be much more of an open field for many, many, many companies to enter. And some companies have entered and are developing domain specific things. So the fact that you create a foundation model and you create this hype around it and everybody starts using it, and then you block other companies, that's a particular market organization that we went for. And again, I'm not sure whether that's the only one that we should go. Yes, I am very worried that we are going towards a duopoly of foundation models with Google and Microsoft, and that would be very bad for competition. It would be very bad for the direction of technology.
I mean, there are several, including Princeton developing their own smaller foundation models in order to make it intelligible, to understand better what's going on. I think that's probably the big thing. And, I guess other universities will follow on this too. But typically we have the tradition to end with a positive note. And, I want you to end with a positive note that, all these advancements, do you think we can direct the river in the right direction?
Well, look, I think let me give you the positive and the negative on that.
Let's do first the negative and then end with the positive.
Okay, so the negative is, well, that's both, let me say, it's both a technical and a social question. So the social one is the negative. I think we really require a different mindset, a different way in which we approach Silicon Valley, a different regulatory environment. And there, it's a big hill to climb. Technically, I think it's very feasible. Look at in the renewable energy space. Look at in HIV/AIDS, where a small amount of pushback from society led to a major redirection of technological change. And technically, I think generative AI, exactly like you said, Markus, is a very flexible technology. So I don't see any barriers in developing it in a very human complementary direction. So technically, it's very feasible. And that's why I think this is an urgent time to have this conversation. People are talking about existential risk, which may or may not be relevant for the 22nd century. I don't think it's going to be relevant for the 21st century. I think we should be talking about the current choices that we're making about the future of technology, which is going to have tremendous effects on inequality, on who controls information, who controls data, what happens to democracy in the next decade.
Very good. So let's do that. And I think you will be pushing for that and make a big impact on this with your book, with Simon Johnson. Thanks again, Daron, for it's great to have you on the podcast, and we stay in touch.
Thank you for doing it, for inviting me, Markus. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye, everybody. And thanks to everybody for joining us, and hope to see you soon again.
Thank you.
Thanks.